Glen Schofield has been a game developer that I have followed for quite some time, ever since he had led the way into building the studio Sledgehammer Games under Activision. Originally, I wanted to make this video back in November, leading up to the release of the Callisto protocol, but life had gotten in the way and other projects had taken over, leading myself to construct this timeline nearing the end of 2022. The intention of this video is to see how Glen had gotten to become the CEO of a studio, known as Striking Distance Studios, deconstructing his career as it were. And as many of you know, I took some time to break down his tweets following the very shaky or stuttering release of the Callisto protocol. However, the deeper I had dug into this topic, I could see a pattern developing, with some rough releases, and that the heralded creator of horror hadn't been what I had thought him to be all along. From working on a TV show to creating the foundations of Dead Space to ending an era of boots on the ground, all the way to the frozen wastelands of Callisto. This is the realm of Glen Schofield.
Oh, can't you see we're running out of time? You're gonna lose your mind if you think you're doing fine. We're running out of time. You're gonna lose your mind if you think you're doing fine. Why do you break all of your promises? I see this emptiness inside of you. Is this your way out the road? Don't let them make you feel small. You know these dreams are not yours, and we're running out of time. We're running out of time. You're gonna lose your mind if you think you're doing fine.
Not much is known about Glen's childhood or his life before his career in video game development. However, what we do know is that Glen had grown up in New Jersey. In this time of his life, he began to pursue an interest in drawing, and this soon turned into a passion. His parents would encourage this of him, and Glen would begin to take lessons in art and design, which would impact his future pursuits greatly. Following his passion in drawing and creating art, Glen would attend the Pratt Institution in his pursuit of mastering his techniques, and ones that may have crossed his mind at the time. Here he would continue learning about art, but he would also go to the Golden Gate University in order to learn about the world of business, allowing him insight and to learn about business theory, management, economics, entrepreneurship, marketing, accounting, and finally, business law. Soon Glen would graduate both schools, awarding him with a BFA or a Bachelor of Fine Arts from the Pratt Institution and a MBA or Master of Business Administration from the Golden Gate University. The university would cite Glen Schofield as a graduate who had exhibited extraordinary professional achievements and contributions to the community. Glen at this time would be overjoyed by the two achievements he had managed to build for himself. However, these achievements would only be the beginning, a gateway into something greater as he began to look into a career that would lead into game development in the years to come. Sometime prior to jumping into the video game industry, Glen had also worked as a storyboard artist for the 1980s TV show The Adventures of the Galaxy Rangers. The show would only run for a single season, however Glen had finished his task, which had been designing over 100 characters in a team of 19 storyboard artists. The show would air from September 14th, 1986 to December the 11th, 1986. In 1990, Glen had continued his career in art by becoming an artist for the gaming industry, where he began working for High-Tech Expressions, a studio that had been located in Lower Manhattan, New York City. In Glen's own words, the team thought it would be funny for the new guy to work on a girls' game. Being new to the industry, however, Glen would do what many in his shoes would do. He would dive into the trenches, keeping his head down, and began his work on this new and exciting game. He would work in the artist's team as the lead artist. In little less than a year, the game was finished and was ready to be sent off to be mass produced, and the game would be Barbie Game Girl, which is something that reminds myself of the term girl gamer, used to describe women who play video games. The game, however, wouldn't be that much of a success, with the reviews coming back with a 2.5 out of 5 from All Game, and Power Unlimited giving the game a 65 out of 100. The reviewers would remark that Barbie Game Girl is clearly an effort to get more girls to play games. Unfortunately, the people who made it didn't fully understand that girls also just want games that are fun to play. However, Power Nintendo would praise the game for its easy game mechanics that would be perfect for Barbie fans who were new to the gaming world. After this, Glen would leave the studio and New Jersey once he had moved to Seattle. His next stop in the world of gaming would be the company of THQ, which had originally been in the toy business but had recently moved to video games. His next project would be a game for the Sega Genesis. However, that effort would be cancelled for that specific platform. Instead, the game would be developed for the Game Boy and NES platforms. Glen Schofield had been at the time working as the lead artist for the game's development. The game would borrow the system that other games of this 2D era had brought to them, such as the Simpsons games like Bart vs. the Space Mutants. In this game, the player plays as the Swamp Thing from the DC animated series and comics, as he battled his foes through the swamps he resides in. The game, upon release in 1991, would receive a mixed response, with some criticizing the difficulty of the game and its many levels, poor sound design, and dulled down gameplay, with the highest score being a 4 out of 10 from Electronic Gaming and a 2.4 from Nintendo Power. Using this criticism as a crutch, Glen would use it to move forwards in his career, and he soon began work on another project at Acclaim Entertainment, where he would work there as the lead artist once again, working on a Simpsons game called Bartman meets Radioactive Man. Like the last game we talked about, this one is also in color, and the design looked better than the Swamp Thing, possessing slightly more detail. However, upon release in the following year, the reception would be mostly negative, with the gameplay once again being criticized. The gameplay seemed very basic, with some handicaps that had affected the enjoyment reviewers would have when scoring the game. The Nintendo Magazine system would also state that the game has a promising manner but falls short of other games such as Krusty's Fun House, calling Bartman meets Radioactive Man generic. and that if someone were not to pick the game up, then they would not be missing out on much. Others would praise the game for its gameplay, with Jonathan Carter stating that they have yet to see the Simpsons game have a bad gaming experience. Bartman's actions and the graphics are good. The average score the game would receive had been a 54 out of 100. However, in 1992, Glen had not been just working on one project, but 3 other games all at the same time, which explains his mindset when it comes to crunching in the workplace. However, a little bit of context here too explains this mindset, that the industry itself would encourage this culture, encouraging their employees to put as much time as humanly possible into their projects so that they can release the products faster, and with a faster production or development rate would reward the companies or publishers with a faster revenue rate. So from this, they would deem this to be an acceptable practice, and those who were willing to crunch in the workplace were the ones that would climb the ladder that much faster. Returning to THQ after his part to play with the last game in Acclaim Entertainment, he would work on The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle and Friends, Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, and under Absolute Entertainment, he would also work on Super Battle Tank. So let's unpack each of these together. Being the director of art, Glen would be responsible for the game's graphical design and leading the other artists into making the game as desirable as possible. With the current technological level the studio and company had possessed, the reception of the game upon its individual releases are mixed, with the game ranking with an average score of 50 out of 100. The next game Glen had worked on as an artist at this time had been Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, which had been a complete disaster. Not just with the gameplay, the graphics weren't exactly anything to pat themselves on the back with. The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle and Friends possessing a higher set of graphics for the same platform. Upon release, this game would be reviewed as the worst sequel of 1992, but by simply looking at the game, it would be hard to find a game sequel worse than this. The game would receive a single star out of 5, however, even that is being generous for a game that barely functions. It's almost like this game had been designed to be used as a detective's tool to torture their suspects into giving up vital information. The last game Glen had worked on in this year would be Super Battle Tank, War in the Gulf, under Absolute Entertainment, which had been a tank simulation game where you would drive a tank and blast enemies to bits. The graphics were indeed great for the time, however the gameplay did not have much variety other than battling aircraft, scud launchers, and other tanks. The reception would praise the graphics, but the gameplay's repetitive nature would put a lot of reviewers and gamers off, alike with the final score of the game being a 50 out of 100, with the graphics carrying the gameplay. In the following years, Glen would work on a title called Penn and Teller's Smoke and Mirrors as an artist with Absolute Entertainment. The game was to be designed as a collection of mini-games, with those being What's Your Sign, Mofo the Psychic Gorilla, Desert Bus, Buzz Bombers, Sun Scorcher, which had intrigued many people at the time. However, Absolute Entertainment in the next few years would begin to crumble under the poor sales and less than desirable reviews, which had led into the company filing for bankruptcy, and every game within development at the time would be cancelled in 1995. Prior to this, in 1993, Glen would work on the Smoke and Mirrors game, while also working on the art side of 3 other titles, with those being the Ren and Stimpy show Buckaroo, Goofy's Hysterical History Tour, and a version of the Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle and Friends for the SNES platform. The Ren and Stimpy show Buckaroo, upon release, would be mixed with some stating that the designers and artists had failed to present the show's feel and looks, as they didn't look like the show's take at all. However, others would contradict this, stating that the graphics were very much in line with the show, with one quote stating that the game's graphics managed to capture the artistic flavor of the show, but they would also criticize the gameplay and the poor controls in the making of a very unenjoyable experience. Moving on to the next game in this lineup, Goofy's Hysterical History Tour, the reviews for this entry are currently missing. However, by just looking at the game, we can see this to be a very pretty presentation, with the design to be very faithful to the original artists. However, the gameplay had been described to be overly tedious after the first level. The game, however, would be given a pretty good rating, with the graphics once again outshining the gameplay with a score of 7 out of 10. In 1994, 1 year to the total collapse of Absolute Entertainment, Glen would work on another title called Home Improvement: Power Tool Pursuit, which had been a 2D platformer for the sitcom by the same name on the SNES, in which you play as Tim Taylor, who has been sent a rather unintimidating letter by the antagonist of the story, who has stolen your toolkits, and to find them you'll need to search the other TV sets for them, but then they plead with you not to call the cops. Could you imagine if the Joker said that? "Hey Batman, I've planted all these bombs filled with my laughing gas all across Gotham City, but please don't call the cops." But maybe the game or sitcom uses these types of jokes and is known for it, but who knows. The game's level design, enemy placements, designs, and mechanics would be criticized, stating that all of these things combined made for a very repetitive and unenjoyable experience. However, once again, the graphics are the asset that carries the mechanics of the game, with reviews praising them over other things. The game's score would be at the most a 7 out of 10, thanks to the audio and graphical side of the game. In 1995, Glen had worked under Capcom as an artist in the development of the Mortal Kombat movie game, which is a fighter game which was to be expected. However, where the gameplay side had some issues with the controls, the reviewers would be blown away by the stunning graphics and cinematics the game had to offer to add some motivation to the story of the game. They would be very impressed with the mechanics as well. However, others would call Capcom out as to be stealing assets from other video games, such as calling this game a port of the Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Regardless of the reviews giving praise and hailing criticisms at the game, it would sell very well, with the title being labeled as a critical success. The highest score of the game would be 85 out of 100. In the next 2 years, Glen would work on 2 games that were being made by an unknown studio or publisher. However, due to unknown reasons, these 2 games would be cancelled over the following 2 years. These were to be Major Damage and Werewolf. With the early game of Glen's career, we can see many examples of someone learning the ropes in the industry, moving in order to mount a front in the industry, and crunching his way up the ladder. However, will all of this be worth it in the next part of this retrospective? We shall see, as we move past the veil and into the next era of the crunch to the top of the ladder. In 1995, the gaming company known as Domark had rebranded themselves into Eidos Interactive, with Simus and Big Red Software merging into the company. Glen at this time had joined the team at Crystal Dynamics as the vice president of the studio, where he would work as the game director for the development of Gex: Enter the Gecko, which would be designed to be a 3D platformer on the PlayStation. Taking inspiration from Super Mario 64, the team would seek to rebuild the character from the success of the past Gex game. The course of the development would be 2 years since the game was aimed to be released in 1997, and they would be successful. The reception of the game would be positive, with GamePro stating a must-own for platform fans. Dmitry Estrin would also chime in with his review, where he would state the developers skillfully managed the resources available to them. However, with positivity there will always be room for criticisms. A criticism that the game lacked attention to detail and care, that the monsters had very few polygons, and a poor camera system had been put into place. However, all reviewers said despite of the gameplay issues, they all had fun playing the game. The score for the game on Game Rankings would be an 82 out of 100. After the development of Gex 2, Crystal Dynamics would take on a project where the player would help guide a warrior out of the realm of the underworld they had found themselves to be trapped in, and this would be known as Akuji the Heartless. Glen once again would direct the development, however even this would give him a challenge, where he would be handed another commission for a sequel to Gex: Enter the Gecko. So Glen would work on both projects, where he would direct Crystal Dynamics in the development of Akuji the Heartless, and Crave Entertainment in developing the third Gex game. Taking the criticisms of the last game Glen had directed, the developers would aim to create a superior experience with a larger set of levels, textures, on-screen characters, and retooling the camera system. Like the last, Gex 3 would take inspiration from not just Super Mario 64, but from popular game Banjo-Kazooie. The developers would even change the overworld or main hub between the game's levels, making it a playable level itself with a set of secrets hidden within it. The camera system too would be changed with a 3D camera system. However, due to the limitations of the hardware and the controllers used at the time, they opted to make a system that would work in the favor of the player and not directly controlled by the player, basically being an optimized version of the last system. Coming to the end of 1998 on December the 31st, Akuji the Heartless would release, and the reviews would be positive with small criticisms of the game's controls, stating that they were rough, but the game was fun, providing gamers with a solid title. The game would receive 3 stars out of 5 by Next Generation, with the final word being that the rough controls and animations had pushed Akuji back into the shadows of the underworld. However, the next game would make Akuji the Heartless look like a perfect masterpiece. Gex 3 Deep Cover Gecko would debut on the PlayStation in March 1999, and separate versions of the game would later be sold on other consoles, such as the Nintendo 64 and the Game Boy Color. The reception would be kind of favorable, to say the least. However, the issues seemed to outweigh the positives. The PlayStation version would be given the highest rating out of 3 platforms, with that being a 77 out of 100. The reviews would talk about the impressive graphics, and the rating was related to the fact that there hadn't been much competition for platformers on Sony's platform at this time. However, on the Nintendo 64, the cracks would show, with the game stuttering uncontrollably, the controls not taking the joystick into account, failing to create a fair comparison to platformers such as the Mario games. Next Generation would speak on the game, stating that the game was very much a cookie-cutter experience from beginning to end, and that Gex 3 was to be a passable game, but just barely. The Game Boy version would be given a 71 out of 100, and the Nintendo 64 version would be given a 65 out of 100. After the poor execution of the third Gex game, it would seem that Crystal Dynamics would see quantity as superior to quality. However, Glen would lead the direction of Crystal Dynamics in the task of creating a racing game, featuring Disney characters in a 1-year development cycle. The developers would aim to create an experience similar, and I mean that very loosely, similar to that of the Mario Kart game, with the tracks being inspired by the attractions at the Disney parks, with those being Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, Blizzard Beach, Dinosaur, Rockin' Roller Coaster, The Haunted Mansion, The Jungle Cruise, Tomorrowland Speedway, Space Mountain, and finally, Pirates of the Caribbean. However, in this game, you would race in an effort to get parts for a fireworks machine rather than trophies, much similar to that of the collectathon racing game Diddy Kong Racing, where the player would race to gain golden balloons in order to progress through the domains in the main hub world. The game would release in 2000, and the reception wouldn't be great, with such criticisms pointing towards the skill of the CPU racers, noting that the game had been too difficult, graphics being poor in comparison to the game's main line of inspiration, regardless of being 4 years ahead of the Nintendo 64 racing games, and the track's soundtrack being comprised of the attractions they had been based on, which would be entertaining at first. However, because the attraction songs had been looped throughout the races, they would grow tiresome and annoying to listen to. Others would bring attention to the alarming similarities to Nintendo's Mario Kart 64, which made it look like a cheap knockoff. Greg Orlando of Next Gen said, "Video game behemoth Eidos has fallen to the notion that wacky characters plus karts plus odd power-ups automatically equals a good racing fun game. It simply does not." The rating on Metacritic would be 65 out of 100, and Game Rankings would award the game with a 66 out of 100. With another poor execution, Glen would be thinking on creating a brand new IP with a few ideas flickering through his mind. He would attempt to create another racing game, this time using the criticisms of the past games that had been poorly executed or designed. This is where Crystal Dynamics would take on the project of Mad Dash Racing. The development of this project would push towards a new innovation direction, with the characters themselves racing with their own abilities rather than relying on racing karts, cars, or bikes, which seemed to be a very good approach. Definitely something new, with the characters being loaded into 4 separate categories, all with their own powers to be used to get ahead of the other racers, with bashers being able to smash through barriers that would otherwise obstruct certain paths in this race, dashers being able to utilize a boost of speed to get ahead of the others, gliders being able to jump further than other racers and added with the ability to glide, and the last being bosses that could use all of the previously spoken about abilities. In November 2001, the game would be released to the public, and the reaction of the reviewers wouldn't be as terrible as their last. However, they would criticize the difficulty once again, stating that the game is a hardcore kart racer, despite its misleading cute and fuzzy look. They would also bring up the similarities to Sonic R and Running Wild, and the game would be awarded with a Metacritic rating of 65 out of 100. Glen at this time began directing the development of Blood Omen 2 Legacy of Kain, with the original Team Soul Reaver crew not being involved. The pressure would certainly begin to seep into the studio. They would attempt to create an experience that was both fun and challenging, with the combat being broken up with puzzles found throughout the game. However, at this time, Glen had begun to work in EA Sports as an executive producer for the game Knockout Kings 2003. For context, an executive producer is a senior role. They would be in charge of managing all games in production. They take charge of employment, finances, and lead a team of producers. Glen at this time, however, only had experience as a director and creator, but not as a producer, which is something that is most desirable in the industry. However, due to Glen's extensive knowledge in his business studies and past experiences, it can be seen that he had been a perfect match for the role. Blood Omen 2 would soon release on the 21st of March 2002, and the reception would be generally favourable, with such quotes as, "Even with the ordinary combat and rather tedious puzzles, Blood Omen 2 still manages to be compelling enough to keep you playing until the end," which is a testament to the overall presentation and varied locales. However, criticism would soon fall upon the developers once again, with such quotes as, "Less demanding players will be more tolerant of the game's repetitive nature, while others will yearn for something juicier to sink their teeth into," leaving the game with an average score of 67 out of 100. Knockout Kings would be released on the 9th of October 2002 for the GameCube, and the reaction would be overly positive, with many reviews rushing to praise the game for its graphics, gameplay, and its tough but fair challenges. However, BBC Sport for some reason would comment on this, stating, "Personally, I'd rather face 15 rounds with Mike Tyson than play this again." The overall score on Metacritic would be left as a 78 out of 100. Perhaps we can start to see a pattern forming now. With nearly every single game Glen had directed, the game had received poor reviews, whether the criticisms were average or major. It would seem with the hunger for knowledge on how the industry works, Glen had been crunching and neglecting the projects he had been directing. However, if we are being fair here, he only had been working in the industry for little over a decade, and he already became a director and an executive producer in that time, which is a remarkable feat to attain. Perhaps with a little bit more care in the future, he can show everyone what he is truly capable of. Moving away from Crystal Dynamics, Glen would join the team at EA Redwood Shores as a producer in the next game in development, with that being known as The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King, where the developers would work with the filmmakers and actors of the franchise in order to bring the consumers a product that they would never forget. Glen would speak about the collaboration of the filmmakers and the developers in an interview that they worked very closely with New Line Cinema. However, Peter Jackson would go on to describe the collaboration very differently. He would state that the developers had brushed off the advice of the filmmakers and ultimately didn't care much for Peter's input, which would cost EA another IP, as Peter would state in the future that EA would not be involved in the development of the King Kong game. Despite of the issues within the development process, upon release the game would be generally favorable towards the developers. However, as we have seen before, no game is exempt from criticism. The game would be criticized for its poor placement of the camera system, with Matthew Cato stating, "What's the use of a new graphics engine and character models when the view is from so far away?" Another critic would state, "Camera switches which reverse the controls, or worse, completely obscures your viewpoint. On just about every mission the camera switches, confusing the hell out of you." The saving system would also be criticized, stating that the game only allows you to save after each completed level, not in between, forcing the player to slog through the same sequences over and over again. Critics also stated that the cutscenes were unskippable, which would make them a chore to watch in a second or third playthrough. The objectives of the levels would too be criticized as not being clear enough, with certain levels being rehashed versions of levels from the Two Towers. However, most of the feedback had generally been positive, which makes a nice change from Glen's track record. In 2004, however, Glen would become the executive producer once again, this time for the development of the James Bond game From Russia with Love that aimed to be a loosely based adaptation of the film, pursuing a different story and having a different antagonist in the events. However, due to these changes, the game would be criticized once released in 2005, but it would be the AI system and level design that would be heavily criticized, and the scores on Metacritic would range from 61 to 71 out of 100. Glen would express his views on the ratings, stating that he had been very disappointed with them. With this, Glen would take a step back at this point, thinking on what makes the other franchises popular, studying the art of them. He would play titles such as Resident Evil 4, and looking at older horror films, such as The Thing, attempting to become inspired by them, and an idea would begin to grow within his head. And over the next few months, Glen would give the executives in the Ivory Tower a pitch for a sequel to the System Shock games, and after some time they would accept, giving him the time he needed to come up with something intriguing to cite their interest further in the project. Glen truly at this time had become inspired by the concept of horror, looking to films such as Alien, The Thing, and Event Horizon. He would also look into the universes of the Resident Evil and Silent Hill series. Glen would seek to create the most terrifying experience possible. He would then come up with Rancid Moon, envisioning a scenario similar to Escape from New York that would be set within a prison planet in outer space. However, through the many alterations of the project, the team would eventually come down to a consensus on the title, Dead Space. The team would do something different, however, that was contrasted to how other studios began the conception stage, with many thinking on gameplay and locations. The team under Michael Condrey's and Brett Robbins' direction would look at their story first, hence why Dead Space had a strong foundation prior to the game even being released, which would solidify the world for players, making the USG Ishimura feel more grounded, especially with its industrial design. While in production, the game was to have a plethora of jump scares. However, they soon found them to be tiresome as the game progressed, so they removed most of them in order to keep the tension and atmosphere of the game, in order to create an unsettling experience, which had been something that Glen wanted to craft, an experience that was to be the scariest someone had encountered. 2 years would pass until the team had decided to show the world what they had for them in September 2007. EA Redwood Shores would unveil the terror within the planet cracker, Dead Space. This had been the biggest production of Glen's career at this point, as Dead Space would come with an episodic series online on the website Dead Space No Known Survivors, telling one story that leads up to the events of the game and another tale that occurs during the events of Dead Space. A comic book would be printed telling the story of the colony prior to the marker extraction and what would become of the colony after the Planet Crack operation had commenced. And an animated movie would also tell us on how the Planet Cracker had fallen in Dead Space Downfall. All of this combined had been EA's idea to create an exclusive campaign for their original IP, which alone, these stories would do little to grow the game's audience. However, together the stories had blown the game open soon after the release. Upon release, however, in the following year, journalists would recommend the game, giving a lot of praise to the atmosphere, feels, and sound effects of the game. The innovation the game had presented were too astonishing, with the HUD system being located on the back of the character. Menus like the inventory, map, journal entries, and mission logs had all been accessible in real time. so no longer would players have to access these menus by pausing the game. Whereas most would praise the gameplay, some found certain areas and locations a bit frustrating to slog through. But after the chapter had been over, the atmosphere and sound design more than made up for the flaws of the repetitive objective system. However, the story was to be the weakest asset in the game. Unlike the world building for the game, the main storyline inside of the game had been lackluster for many, with certain story beats being glossed over. The graphics, however, had truly been ahead of its time, with many praising them still to this day, which just goes to show how much of an excellent job the team had done. Out of 25 nominations for the Game Awards, the game would win 13 of them. However, if you would like to know more about the success of this game, then I suggest you check out my retrospective on EA Redwood Shores and Visceral Games. The game would be rated very highly, with the highest being awarded on Metacritic as an 89 out of 100 on the Xbox 360. However, on the PC, the rating would be a little bit lower, as the game had still accomplished its task by providing said entertainment, but the gameplay would be plagued with a bad PC port for the controls. GamePro would give the game a perfect score, however, of 5 stars, and Dead Space would be heralded as a masterpiece from most gamers worldwide. Throughout the rest of 2008, Glen would find that his reputation had indeed grown from the success of Dead Space, and Edge would name Schofield as one of the hot 100 game developers of 2009. However, Dead Space would be labeled as a commercial failure by the executives inside of the ivory tower of Electronic Arts. Following this, however, they would agree to allow the studio in the production of Dead Space Extraction, which behaved very much like an arcade shooter, taking full advantage of the Wii motion control system. However, long story short, the game wouldn't even sell 10,000 copies at the release, which had disappointed the developers and executives, even baffling Glen. The executives had not been happy with Glen at this point, and after a disagreement, Glen would leave the company with Michael Condrey. The exact details of this conversation hasn't been made public, except from a tweet from Glen that shows a side to him that is distasteful. In 2010, he would express his feelings in the words, "Wow, a year ago today I left EA. What a day that was. They really treated me like shit after creating Dead Space for them." Now, Glen hasn't always had the best track record in dealing with his feelings on Twitter, especially when others criticize him or his work, and I can sympathize with that. However, to state that Dead Space, or the Dead Space they had delivered to us, was all because of his actions and his actions alone is a bit of an overstatement. See, the game Glen wanted to create was to be on a moon with a prison, something that he would later create. But the game we got was a team effort, not something he had remodeled all on his own, which just shows himself to be in not such a good light. Personally, I believe that his decision to leave Electronic Arts had been on a whim after a board meeting, due to Extraction not selling well, and the executives made sure to let him know that those numbers were to be unacceptable. However, I could also see that the decision to leave EA could have been that he wanted recognition for his part to play in the creation of Dead Space, that he was deserving of a higher position within the company, and when the executives did not reward him, he left. Regardless, however, Glen would co-found a studio with Michael Condrey, and they would sign a contract with Activision in 2010. And while the two would start constructing an internal team, they would be assigned to help with the development of Modern Warfare 3, in which they would co-develop the multiplayer, allowing Infinity Ward to focus primarily on the campaign. The reason that Activision enlisted Sledgehammer into the development of Modern Warfare 3 was due to the legal disputes between Jason West and Vince Zampella and Activision, which had resulted in the pair being fired, and several of the developers would leave with them, leaving those who remained in the studio without a leg to stand on. Sledgehammer would use this to their advantage to get their foot in the door, aiming for a bug-free experience, which upon release the developers seem to have not kept their word. Unless you were playing the campaign, of course. as the multiplayer possessed quite a few bugs and issues. However, this was to be expected, as many bugs and glitches always managed to find a way to slip through the cracks. The response to the release was to be called a critical response, with a whole plethora of praise being rained down upon the developers with the gameplay, the story of the single-player campaign, with its action gun-ho experience and drama between characters, making for a memorable experience for those familiar to the stories of the Modern Warfare series. Metacritic ratings would be similar to that of Dead Space, with a score of 88 out of 100 for Xbox and PlayStation, and the PC would receive a 78 out of 100. However, the Wii would gain a 70 out of 100 for the downgraded graphics. All in all, it would seem that Sledgehammer had a bright future ahead of them, especially when they would begin the development for their own Call of Duty game, as Modern Warfare 3 may have been a success, yes, but the vision was not Glen's or Michael's, and it had been scripted to be a Modern Warfare title. So now the reins are indeed theirs. While Modern Warfare 3 had been in the later development prior to its release, Glen and Michael had been brainstorming on their actual future Call of Duty title, which would be later known as Call of Duty Fog of War, which is an interesting one. From the sound of things, it may have been focusing on the mental health side of warfare, showing the audience the horror of war, rather than just glorifying it for the sake of it. The game was set to be in the Vietnam War, and was to be a third-person shooter rather than the traditional first-person perspective. It had been said that the team had completely changed the engine, building it from the ground up, with it becoming the IW engine, which gamers would be able to see why the game was to have a different engine. The game had been announced on the 2nd of May 2014, and the exosuits and their mechanics would make for some intriguing speculation, and others would criticize the lean into the futuristic concepts such as holograms boosting through the air and other concepts that had later been released. In the meantime, Glen would receive something from the Golden Gate University in April of 2014, and he would tweet out, "Wow, received an honorary doctorate today. What an honor. Please call me Dr. Glen." However, once November had come about, the game would be praised for the coherent story, the gameplay, and the near-future feel would bring in a breath of fresh air to the beloved franchise. However, one thing to touch up upon with the story is that the original ending to the campaign had been revealed in an interview with the actor who played Mitchell. See, the original ending was to be that the characters had been locked in their exoskeletons by irons, and he would pull the gun towards his head, telling you to pull the trigger. And the reason for this unhinged behavior was that every movement needs a martyr in order to be effective, which would have made more sense to Iron's character. But let's be fair, I think we all know where Glen and Michael might have gotten the idea for that. A martyr? A movement? I think I'll leave that with you. Instead, we get an ending sequence that doesn't really make sense. Why doesn't Irons shoot Mitchell with his own gun? Why is he just running away? However, the next sequence is, "I gave you that arm," while he holds onto it. And what does Mitchell do? Well, he cuts it off, which is a little generic. Personally, I think that the original ending would have held up much better, especially if the ending would have a pan through time to see the consequences of Iron's martyr. The multiplayer, on the other hand, had been very well done, with the flow of the matches through the gameplay, decision making with more options, but one thing that the developers added on top of that had come before was the 13 system in the creator class, where you can remove anything in order to build the class that you want, giving the players a huge amount of customization. Don't want kill streaks but more perks? Sure, go for it. Want more attachments? Do it. The options allow for you to customize the classes to suit your playstyle, which was honestly a genius move to improve upon the past innovations to the experience. However, something new here would have to be the ability to customize the kill streak rewards. However, remember Dead Space 2 where the two sides of multiplayer aren't exactly very balanced against one another? Well, Advanced Warfare probably saw the issues and decided on making every single weapon have near enough the exact same damage, excluding snipers versus pistols, obviously, so a low-ranking submachine gun or rifle would handle nearly the same as a high-ranking one. So my question is, why bother using the later weapons? One thing is to be said here that Advanced Warfare had significantly raised the bar on skill with its strafe abilities, as many players just couldn't get to grips with the new way to play. I certainly remember adjusting to the strafes and the double jumps, so where people say skill issue, I say when a game series follows a certain trend such as boots on the ground for a majority of the installments, but then a new game comes out with all these weird and wacky different abilities and all that, then it's going to shake the player base up a little bit. However, once people got to grips with it, the multiplayer was said to be entertaining. One thing that many had taken issue with, however, was the first appearance of the supply drops that can be attained through the game itself or can be bought in case the grind is too much for one to handle before getting that juicy loot. However, the drops rarely had anything that could be considered a game changer. The next big thing to talk about is the survival mode, which had been something that Glen had been very excited for. However, when playing through the game, many couldn't understand why, as getting through a set number of rounds, the gameplay, much like Modern Warfare 3's survival mode, would begin to grow stale rapidly. That was until you came towards the last map in the selection, as when you get to a certain round, the entire atmosphere of the mode shifts into something that I can only describe as what Treyarch had done in World at War.
Team, report status! Report status! Allied forces, this is Gideon. Does anyone copy? Is anyone out there? This is Gideon. Do you copy? Welcome back, team. Thought we lost you. Armories are down. Exos are offline. The EMP blast must have knocked them out. That DNA bomb should have taken you out. It must have been targeted only at hostile forces. But why? Heads up, team. Something's headed your way. Fast movers. Lots of them. Grab a weapon and ready up. Exos are back up. Use boost jump to evade.
Soldier, look at me! Are you bitten? What happened down there? You're okay. You're safe now, son. There's not many of us left. Jesus. You seeing this?
All of this was to tease the first DLC that Glen had been itching for people to play, that contained a follow-up to this event that would become to be known as Exo Zombies, which had been a fun time, and the story was fun as well, but the voice acting and the lines left a lot to be desired, and the names of the perks or upgrades weren't very inspiring either. For example, in Treyarch's zombie mode, Juggernog gives you more health. In Exo Zombies though, you had Exo Health, which sounds like this was to be a basic version of a fan-made map. However, one thing I will never forget, however, was when Oz turns into a zombie, and his narration through the cutscenes were to be amazing, with my favourite being, what nobody factored, was one of the pets
was about to slip his leash.
The gameplay on the other hand wasn't that much fun as when compared to Treyarch. Like, there wasn't any wonder weapons that made the experience exciting when you get to the 3D printer, which was just a remodeled mystery box. And instead of using one machine to upgrade your weapons, there are panels that will do it for you, scattered across the map. However, if you would like to learn more about what makes this game tick through all of its features, then a link to Chopper's video playlist will be in the description for the Call of Duty Retrospective down below. Metacritic will leave the game standing tall with an 83 out of 100, and gamers today call Advanced Warfare as a beautiful end to an era of boots on the ground. However, one more thing that will relate to something in the future is that the game also came out with a lag issue in its gameplay that added to the players' frustrations, and Glen would feel their wrath on social media, especially when it came to the connectivity issues that were a very big issue for online play. Glen, however, would respond to these criticisms or flat out abuse on Twitter, attempting to quell the online riots. However, as we have seen before, this hardly ever works out as an individual trying to quell something like this. A notable attempt to have a reasonable discussion would be this tweet. I understand some people are a bit upset, like I was with leaks, but I never disrespected people and tried to have an intelligent discussion. Somebody leaking your game is exactly the same as charging someone $60 for a game with frustrating issues that should have been cleared up prior to the launch. Some issues that could have been fixed if a little bit more attention to detail was given. Unfortunately, this isn't just merely a Activision problem. His tweet comes across as condescending, stating that the community was a bit upset, which was the understatement of the year. Throughout the course of the season, Glen would either get some insults or abuse thrown at him, and he would retaliate on Twitter, telling someone hurling insults at him because of the frustration in the game, that was intelligent, implying that they aren't intelligent. Which, looking at this in hindsight, was understandable, but this would come back to bite him in the future. After the heat had died down after the season, Glen and Michael would begin their work together on their next project, Call of Duty World War II, having a bigger team than they did when they had been working on Advanced Warfare in the early days. They set out to create something very ambitious in highlighting the horror aspect of the warfare within the trenches of World War II. However, would this be a step up from the older titles, or would it fall short? The team had wanted to create a realistic approach when it came to providing players with a Second World War experience, and so they began by throwing out the standard healing system, and instead went back to traditional healing systems, with the player having to use first aid kits in order to restore their health, rather than just having a Wolverine or Deadpool healing factor. Glen had even wanted to create realistic environments within the campaign, so much so that he had paid an expensive trip to these sites that battles had taken place in, so that he could study them in order to translate the photos taken into a breathing, living world within the universe of Call of Duty. However, once Glen had spoken about the hard work he had been doing, an article would ridicule him for his words. The quote reads as follows: "You're working with experts. I studied World War II for 3 years. I worked with historians. I spent 8 days in a van in Europe, going to all of the places that were going to be in the game. I shot different old weapons. All of these things that you have to do when you are working on a Call of Duty game." The journalist would criticize the game developer as going on vacation, while the rest of the team had been working inside of the offices of Sledgehammer Games. And I would have to say this is a complete fabrication. Many developers, filmmakers, and even authors of popular books, make expensive trips in order to gain inspiration or to accurately depict locations or to even film on location. So I personally wouldn't call that a holiday or a vacation. Otherwise, we could just sit here and say that every single filmmaker goes on holiday every single year when they are filming in a completely different country, because that could be a tourist attraction that they're filming at. Kind of like Peter Jackson when he was making the Lord of the Rings films. That was nothing but just a 3-month holiday, right? The journalist obviously has no idea of how films, games, or even books are to be made, instead seeing Glen as an easy target due to how he handles situations on Twitter. The journalist is clearly in the wrong, but perhaps if Glen had held back like his colleagues certainly do, switching off as it were, then perhaps journalists would not see him as an easy target. Again, Kotaku is in the wrong and shouldn't have painted him in this light, but perhaps if this advice was to be adhered to, then it wouldn't come back to bite him in the future. In August of 2017, however, Glen would hear some very devastating news with the fate of Visceral Games, where he would tweet out in memory of them. Stunned to learn EA is shutting down Visceral Games. Great place at one time. Our thoughts to those being impacted. What a legacy. Can't stop thinking about Visceral Games, aka Redwood Shores. I learned a lot there. Once a who's who of video game legends. I am bummed. 5 days to the release of the next Call of Duty, someone would leak the game out, and Glen would find out about the betrayal. He would tweet out the following: "Leaks? Again? Come on, man! You couldn't have waited 5 more days?" Bummed and disappointed. Don't spoil it for yourselves. Enjoy as it is designed. I know leaks happen. It's a part of the business. Just frustrating. But I understand the anticipation and hype drives it too. This kind of shows us context to what he would say about reviewers in the future. However, I can understand from his point of view as a creator myself. I want to maintain a schedule and I feel like, oh, I want to release it early so I can see the comments and reactions flutter in. But I must control myself, and it can be very disappointing when someone leaks out gameplay or story elements or something else. Upon the release, however, the game would be praised for the gameplay, the graphics, the sound design, and the music. However, the story and gameplay would be criticized, with the story seeming more like a Band of Brothers game rather than an actual story that wanted to show the true horror of the battlefields, with the plot focusing on the relationships of the squad more than the war as a whole. Personally, I like the focus on the team, but perhaps a little more focus on the war was to be shown here. Something like Call of Duty Finest Hour could have been made here, with 3 separate campaigns being given to us. The Russians, the Americans, and the British campaigns would have been interesting. You could have even had it where you spend the first few missions seeing the bonds of the brothers or soldiers grow as they fought together to win these skirmishes. Then they could have been reassigned to reinforce separate locations, allowing for us to play as these characters across the world, showing the battles they had to fight in separately, and show how the squad mates' absence had impacted the characters we would have been playing as. However, the story was completely all over the place throughout the campaign. However, the ending of the game where we get to see the concentration camps as we walk through one of them, and it says, "Get your camera out, the world's got to see." And every time he snaps a picture, you get to see a real life picture of, like, say for instance, the row of beds in the concentration camp, the nooses, the, the gas chambers, all this stuff was excellently put together. And I really did appreciate that being within the campaign to show the true horror of what they had been fighting for in the Second World War, which is honestly a bit of a gem within the game itself. The multiplayer, on the other hand, was considered a lackluster experience, with players calling it unfinished and boring. The game would take itself completely too seriously throughout the first season. Once again, however, if you wish to know more about why World War II is considered to be one of the worst titles, then a link to Chopper's video is down below in the description, as he can explain it in more depth than I can at this time. However, something interesting that happened on launch was the connections the players would have to the servers would be very shaky, and when someone brings this to Glen's attention, what would he say? Everybody is on it, not a studio issue. Then I would ask, whose issue is that? I assume he is either stating that it's an issue with somebody's internet connection with the router, or that Activision is somehow to blame. Way to bite the hand that feeds you, Glen. See, I wouldn't have said that it would have been an issue with the players' routers or Activision, seeming as when the game launched, the servers hadn't even been turned on, with many error messages telling players attempting to access multiplayer or the co-op modes that the servers are not available. 6 days of problem solving and new issues being identified, the launch had been a complete disaster. However, Glen would make a slight oopsie when attempting to show how hard he and the team had been working on the issues with this reply to Spacey Fowler. Yes, we are well aware and working around the clock. After 3 years making the game, the last thing we want is tech issues. I assure you all, we are crunching to fix things. Thank you for your patience. It would take the developers a grand total of a week to fix the connectivity issues. However, by then, the damage had already been done, and many players had moved on to competing games at this time, with a smaller amount of players playing multiplayer and zombies this time around. Metacritic would end up giving the game a score of 80 for Xbox, 79 for PlayStation, and for PC the score would be the lowest, being that of 73. Over the next month, however, an incident would happen to Glen and his family while they had been staying in a hotel, with the security barging into the room while they had slept in order to change the locks. Bullshit! Without even knocking on the door, and relocating them to another room while they conducted their business. Once again, however, Glen would make a poor choice to vent his frustration out on Twitter, with many of the users affected by the poor release of World War II making fun of him for it, which I have to say is a pretty scumbag thing to do. I mean, imagine if they had died to an intruder and somebody said, that's what you get for making a terrible game. I find it very interesting when people say, oh, I didn't mean it was a prank, bro, it was a prank, bro, when people call them out on it. Pure scum. Eventually, however, Glen would end up leaving the Call of Duty scene altogether and moving out to unfamiliar territory, leaving Activision behind. There are a few reasons as to why he suddenly departed. The stress of the community could have been a bit too much to handle. As you can see, Advanced Warfare combined with World War II had indeed left a pretty memorable impression. The next is that the same thing that happened in 2010 could have happened with Activision, and the last, it could have been the exhaustion with the quote-unquote crunch. He needed a break from the world of competitive play. However, both Michael and Glen would leave together, leaving the teams on multiplayer and zombies creative freedom to do as they had wished. But just like Modern Warfare 3, this would leave the studio with low numbers. So much so that the people that had to work on zombies only had 5 staff members, being able to develop the rest of the zombie DLC maps. However, it would seem that once Glen and Michael had left the studio, moving on to better things, the game's reputation had risen up out of the depths of the shadows, with the multiplayer no longer taking itself so seriously, adding in fun games like Prop Hunt and Infected to the mix, bringing the fan base back into the fold. After his departure, Glen would take a step back, posting mostly art in his spare time to Twitter, but he would mostly enjoy his life for now, focusing on his craft. But he would soon get back into gear as he began tugging and pulling at the strings once again as he slipped back into the shadows. Sometime later, his name would re-emerge within a new publisher, Krafton, and he would announce that he had become the CEO of Striking Distance Studios, and they both would together begin developing a game that had once been seen to become Dead Space. However, this time it would be completely Glen's vision, the Dead Space he wanted to tell, and it would completely trump the previous game. Originally, the Callisto Protocol was to be made into the PUBG universe, a game that Krafton had owned for quite a significant time. However, soon after the announcement had been made, Glen would later state that the game was going to be set in its own universe to allow for more creative freedom, aiming to be as far away from Dead Space as possible. Going off of what Glen had stated to be fact, the team would attempt to do such a thing. However, it would seem that many of the themes and assets derived from Dead Space, so it is hard to say for definite what their goals had been at the time, other than to create a true survival horror. Glen Schofield would use his connections from his time in both Visceral Games and Sledgehammer Games in order to build a strong foundation for his new studio, with such names returning to the fold like Steve Papoutsis and Christopher Stone. However, after the Callisto Protocol had been announced in 2019, the studio had gone dark prior to the pandemic, and we would be left in the dark for an entire year while they started to build the studio's offices, until out of the blue a new teaser would appear at an event. However, it wasn't what we had expected. Inspired by the rise in Resident Evil remakes, EA would release a teaser for Dead Space in 2021, which had awoken Striking Distance from their hibernation. Seeing that EA Motive had completely gone transparent with their updates in development, Glen would attempt to use the same strategy for the development of the Callisto Protocol. Riding the wave, he would be successful in hyping the fans up, and in several interviews, Glen would talk about a system that had been implemented into the experience, talking on how the biophages will study the player's play style, that they will use that against them in the later portions of the game. He would further state that the Callisto Protocol isn't going to be Dead Space, and is going to be far from it. He would continue to be very transparent, talking on the motion capture of the game, in how they are to construct the cinematics for the game, and recording certain sequences with the added help of Sony, which we will be coming back to later. He would also explain the melee system with the added dodge system. The pressure certainly had been on, and Glen would be pushing his team hard in order to make the release date in an effort to make the Christmas holidays, so that the sales will be higher due to the season of giving. And this would be evident when Glen would once again fall into the Twitter trap when tweeting the infamous quote, when someone asks how the game is coming along. "I only talk about the game during an event. We are working 6 to 7 days a week. Nobody is forcing us. Exhaustion, tired, COVID, but we are working. Bugs, glitches, performance fixes, one last pass through audio, 12 to 15 hours a day. This is gaming. Hard work, lunch, dinner, working. You do it 'cause you love it." This would stir quite the outrage, with a reporter at Bloomberg quoting the tweet explaining, "Such a coincidence that the guy bragging about how his team works 6 to 7 days a week, 12 to 15 hours a day, because they love it, also happens to be the guy who controls their salaries, titles, and current employment status." This is from a studio head. Is crunch culture defined? Of course, nobody is forced to work insane hours, but imagine the reduced bonuses and lack of promotion opportunities if you don't. You do it 'cause you love it, is weaponized passion. This is why people burn out of gaming. Glen would quickly retract his statement, and a few YouTubers would even praise Glen for crunching his team. However, a few would condemn him for it as well, stating that the amount of people that have died in crunching a specific activity or profession, and that it is astonishing that the industry does nothing for it. Crunch culture is nothing to be proud of. Many like myself would see this as a CEO needing validation for working hard, like he needs his fix of attention before doing the crunch cause he loves it. Glen would then post an apology, or at least some resemblance of one, to try and get the crowd back on his side. Anyone who knows me knows how passionate I am about the people I work with. Earlier, I tweeted how proud I was of the effort and the hours the team was putting in. That was wrong. We value passion and creativity, not long hours. I'm sorry to the team for coming across like this. See, the issue isn't working hard, but crunch culture should be condemned due to the bad health that can come of it in both physical and mental. Later down the line, a similar tactic had been used for the marketing that had been used in Dead Space, where Glen had built an audiobook that would release each episode leading up to the release date. However, something that strikes me as odd for a CEO to say that this isn't Dead Space and how far they were from the franchise is when the audiobook has a lot of nods and events that were very similar to Dead Space, even making notable mentions of Weapons of the Past series, along with the trailers for the Callisto Protocol using some of the same elements such as a warning or message written in blood telling players how to deal with certain enemies. However, I wish that was the extent of the similarities. Prior to the release, the game had been sent out to several reviewers, whether those had been independent creators or companies. However, a story would break a month prior that made many respect Glen for this decision, and that was that he had told the Japanese board that they will not be supporting a censored version. Days from launch, however, many of the independent reviewers would release what they thought about the game, leaking gameplay and the issues, which normally would not have been a problem, but for some reason the reviewers had been told not to release their review until after the game had been released. However, the morality of this decision would come to bite them in the ass. See, the game would release with a lot of stuttering on PC, which had caused the Callisto Protocol to have a steep decline in reviews, and thus refunds would come fluttering in. See, the game is indeed beautiful and has some breathtaking moments, but how does one enjoy these moments when the game isn't even stable? On the Xbox, the game would contain a similar problem, but limited to the cutscenes, along with a weird fuzz that would surround the character's hair, which would be off-putting, along with a 30 frame rate in the cutscenes, but then it quickly switches up to a 60 frame per second in gameplay. So here we are again with the last Call of Duty game, World War II, with a very similar problem. As I always say, if you don't learn from your mistakes, you will be doomed to repeat them in the future. However, the horror itself is an issue too, with the game doing the same as most filmmakers, thinking that ramping up the tension is good, as long as you slam the player with a cheap jump scare. And when I say cheap, I mean cheap, with some dealing damage to the player as they attempt to loot lockers and chests. However, interestingly enough, the only console that had not been affected and seemed to run perfectly was the PlayStation 5. And who owns the PlayStation brand? That's right, Sony. Now, this could be a complete coincidence, but it is a very big coincidence that Sony developers had worked on the game's motion graphics, and Sony's console had been the only one working to 100% at launch, whilst everybody else had issues. Another interesting point is that when Glen spoke about enemies learning from your playstyle, that is completely absent from the game entirely. So either they, didn't put it in the game for an unknown reason, possibly performance issues or something like that, or maybe it just didn't work, and they just told absolutely no one about the update, or that there was never a system like that put into place at all. As much as I would like to talk on the issues with the rest of the game, I think it is time to move on to Glen's overall reaction, but as many of you can guess, it is nearly identical to Call of Duty World War II, with Glen stating that they are working on it while replying to tweets as the hours tick by. Eventually, they would come down to the issue with the shaders that caused the problem, and they had released a patch or update for the game within 24 hours, which is certainly better than the last game he made. But maybe none of this would have happened if the developers had not been crunching and rushing to release. Glen would talk on the reviewers releasing their videos early as a way to warn the customers and players of the Callisto Protocol's many issues, stating, "Yeah, it sucks. People think they are clever and slick to do something like that, but it's so disappointing to the team and spoils it for others. Hopefully true fans will ignore it and play the game that it was meant to be played." I wonder what he meant by play the game it was meant to be played. Seeming as the terms and conditions that many skim through seems to be just a quick copy and paste of PUBG. Personally, I think the reviewers did something very noble, something that, was a justice to the actual people that were going to buy the game, or people that had pre-ordered off of places like Amazon, only to cancel their order once they saw the reviews. So I think that in our society, essentially, a bunch of people or a company or something has a certain responsibility when they are reviewing a product to review the product to the best of their ability and to give you the good sides of the product and the bad sides of the product, regardless of what these are, and to be truthful with these so people can make a good decision on what they're going to buy, essentially. However, people like Glen just seem to be completely ignorant of that issue at all, thinking that people think that they're clever or slick to do something like that. But it's so disappointing to the team and spoils it for others. What, the issues? Not the game itself? I'm sorry, I really wanted my experience to be spoiled by a stuttering. Sorry about that, but that just really grinds my gears when people like Glen say shit like this without actually thinking about what he's actually gonna say. Oh yeah, like it sucks that these assholes just ruined the experience for everybody. No, the intention behind releasing the reviews early was to warn the public that this game is unfinished and it performs terribly, and people will be wasting their money if they go ahead with their purchase. So I feel like the reviewers did a justice to the customers, something that Glen should have done by delaying the release of the game. Moving on, when Glen would be criticized for the stuttering issue not being fixed prior to launch, he would reply, "Being fixed, a wrong file was patched, any minute. Just freaking error by someone rushing." But then he earlier stated that it was a clerical error, and he even said how proud that he was of his team to be crunching and rushing 6 to 7 days, 12 to 15 hours a day for the game. So which is it? Is he proud or disappointed? Because with these contradictions, I can't make sense of this. However, it is interesting that when things go wrong, he states that someone rushed the game, but leading up to the release, he was nothing but proud of the crunch and the rush. Interesting how no one had these issues 2 months prior to the release when it went gold, which would have been more than enough time to playtest it on a PC rather than a PlayStation 5. Scores on Metacritic would award the game with a 70 out of 100 for the PC, a 71 out of 100 for the PlayStation 5, and a 69 out of 100 for the Xbox Series S and X. Later on, Glen would start being condescending towards people complaining about the game, the healing aspects and the stuttering on Xbox, where he would reply, "Did you patch the game?" when a patch or update had yet to be sent out, which shows the disconnect between developer and the CEO. He would also tell people to check the options and then gives a sigh as a literal reply. 3 years of pumping and pumping and pumping the crowd up, only for the biggest disappointment of 2022. With the story leaning back into that familiar territory, with it having the same story beats as Dead Space, but in reverse. Mining colony, Check. Find something inside the moon or planet? Check. Outbreak prior to the actual events of the game? Check. Outbreak 2? Check. Hallucinations? Check. Hearing voices? Check. Necromorphs in the vents? Check. Cut off their limbs? Check. And the list goes on. As far from Dead Space as they could get. They didn't even attempt to create a different story. The only thing missing is, well, the markers. But I guarantee we'll probably find them in the Callisto Protocol Part 2.
Listen, you know they call Callisto the dead moon. Dead.
Well, now you can definitely call the Callisto Protocol the dead game. Glen's journey is one of hard work, yes. There are some moments of putting the work ahead of his own health in order to climb the ladder in the industry, and perhaps that is wrong to do so. However, his story has been corrupted by his comments on crunch culture. Not once, not twice, but 3 times, leading many to believe that he is acceptant of it, which it is what it is. He had admitted time in and time out that he had to rush when working under Activision and other companies, and to that I say, when that is all you know, then it can be very hard to accept other ways of doing things. However, we all make mistakes, and the reason for making mistakes is to learn from them, otherwise we risk repeating history in the future. And I'm afraid Glen definitely hasn't learned a single thing, as he keeps on tripping over these mistakes in the years. However, there are a few redeeming qualities. For instance, he has a tremendous confidence in what he does. He can inspire those around him to push themselves. He is a natural leader, and most importantly of all, when looking back through his career, he is extremely talented at art, which might just be his next venture if he was to fall out of the gaming industry. However, without the ability to shut off from social media, especially when a game comes out with his name on it, then I fear he will never break the cycle he finds himself to be in, thinking too heavily on what others are saying around him, behind his back, and to him on social media, and getting defensive about his games. As we all know, we are our own worst enemy. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, then give the video a like rating. Comment your thoughts below on this topic and I look forward to hearing from you. Sign up to join the British Alliance today by hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell to receive all updates from the channel. Thank you to all of my channel members for your extra mile support. It really helps me in creating more content for everyone. And if you would like to become a member today, then hit the join button and select which of the tiers takes your fancy. And I will see all of you among the cosmos, and be sure to have a good one.